Great. Well, I think we're live, right, Catherine?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So, hello everybody. I'm Richard Whitehall. I'm a partner at Smart Design, and I want to introduce my host, Catherine Eisenberg, who's co-hosting for the first time, and is a strategist at Smart. So today's Smart Salon is all about the future. So it's titled "People from the Future: Making Forecast and Foundational Research More Actionable." So really exciting topic, and we'll before we dig in, I'll just give a quick overview of the series so that you can have a sense of really where these events are coming from. So at the beginning of this year, Smart Design conducted a research study to understand the state of design research across different types of organizations and industry sectors with our clients and people we know in the design industry more broadly. And five themes emerged from that research, and we've run 3 events on the first topics, and today we're sort of digging into this topic of trends and the future. So as you know, the last year has taught us, you never know what's coming around the corner, but design really always needs to think about the future, because the work we're doing is going to exist in that future. So this session is all about how can we as designers think beyond some of the realities of the moment, and sink our teeth into some of the new problems which are going to emerge sort of in the future. And there are some really interesting methodologies that exist out there. So futures and forecasting work offers a really systematic way to think about future states and trends, and create kind of ways of imagining that and then translating this stuff into action. Speculative design is a really interesting methodology, which is really a way of making these future scenarios concrete, and enabling a more informed dialogue about how design can help or sometimes hinder progress in the future. So we've assembled an amazing panel, which is really trying to sort of bridge both the sort of commercial world of futures and the more sort of academic side of futures, and then also kind of thinking about the more speculative design oriented activities, and the more sort of trends and kind of futures side of work. So I'm just going to go through, first of all, welcome all the panelists, and I'm just going to give a quick introduction to each person, and then at the end, each of the panelists is just going to share a quick story about a piece of futures work that sort of they did that they felt had an impact and was kind of useful. So first of all, Jen works with teams across Ford, and really helps them factor in global trends and insights into their work, and across all of Ford's different functions. And in her 17 years at Ford, she's also worked across marketing, design, and research. So she's got a lot of experience on the ground as well. So really bringing those two things together in her role. So welcome, Jen. Secondly, Yi Hyun is a lead researcher at the MIT Civic Design Initiative, where she brings together behavioral research, human-centered design, to really understand the impact of emerging networked technologies on current and future scenarios. So really coming from the kind of tech side, but adding the kind of human part of trends sort of into that. Welcome, Yi Hyun. Next is John, who is responsible for market and technology trend sensing and uncovering strategic opportunities and gaps, and forming recommendations with Intel's executive leadership team that helps to shape different investments for the organization. Welcome, John. And then we have Elliot, who focuses on speculative inquiries at the confluence of social, technological, and environmental impact. He's an associate professor at Parsons, and also the co-founder of the Extrapolation Factory, which is a design futures research studio based in Brooklyn. So welcome to all the panelists. And now we'll just sort of get each one of you just to kind of talk about a little piece of your work, so that the attendees can get a sense of some of the things that you're thinking about. So I will hand it over to Jen to run through her work first. Welcome, Jen.
Sure. Hi. So again, I'm at Ford Motor Company, Global Future and Trends Manager. So we end up splitting our time really between some nearer term consumer trends research, which is what you see there, our 2021 trends book, which we put out last year, I'm sorry, in December, but we put it out every year. And then we also spend time doing futures scenario planning type work. So what you see here was our trends book, which is free to the public. So FordTrends.com. There's a lot of interesting insights in there. Last year was particularly interesting considering the huge impact that COVID had. But just as a quick reference, some of the data that we have in there. And one of the things that we might share when working with teams and in a company is the way that people are using vehicles differently, and seeing the vehicle as kind of an escape pod. So having 1 in 4 people looking at their vehicle as a place to relax, 1 in 5 looking at it as a place to get privacy, and close to 1 in 5 looking at it as a place to work. So of course, thinking of the vehicle in these different use cases and how that might impact our design would be an example of how to use it.
Awesome, great example, Jen. So next we'll go to Yihyun.
Hi, I'm Yihyun, coming from MIT Design Lab and also MIT Civic Design Initiative. So the image you're seeing here is actually it's a mapping of the experiential values that we have been studying of the current kind of the COVID situation of the past year. So we've been doing qualitative research, getting the experiences, what people have been missing or what people have been finding valuable from their social distanced current state, or the lot of the experiences that they are missing from the current state. So with those, so this is a work that I'm doing through MIT Civic Design Initiative, as well as Defluence, a design research practice that I'm heading. So through that, we've been imagining different possible futures that are value driven from some of the values that we have found that are important to think about as we imagine futures that are focused on maybe adopting technology to create, let's say, more meaningful experiences for us in the coming days.
Great, thank you, Yihyun. And next we'll go to John.
Hey, hi everybody. John Miranda, I work at Intel Corporation. I run a cross-company trend sensing program called Trendscape. It's a community of contributors. I'm, let's say, the orchestrator, but I rely on a lot of domain experts across the company. We come together a couple times a quarter and start raising what are significant trends that we think will shape the ecosystem we participate in. And we cast a wide net. I mean, we look at things like architecture, from RISC-V to quantum computing to indigenous compute initiatives in China, to trade tensions, to data sovereignty issues and GDPR, and what's the implications to compute. So we look at a broad array of topics, and then we zero in on the few that we think are highly important to us and raise those within our executive community. One example we drove last year that I can share is thinking about sustainable computing. So we saw more and more signals from our customers, from regulatory, consumer concern around the impact of energy and compute and kind of, let's say, the climate change. So that led to a set of initiatives we raised across our executives that are now driving work streams with our largest customers, both in a data center and in a PC space, around thinking about how do we make compute more sustainable into the future. So that's an example.
Awesome, great, John. Thank you. And then we'll go to Elliot.
Thank you for having me. So I'm an assistant professor at the New School at Parsons in the School of Design Strategies. And I also run a design practice with my collaborator, Chris Wobkin, called the Extrapolation Factory, which is focused on participatory futures done in the name of democratizing the way we tell stories about where we're headed as societies. So the thumbnail that you see here is from a project that we did with the Walker Arts Center where we worked with a group of about 500 to 600 members of the public to envision ways that the city infrastructure could be repurposed so it not only serves humans, but also non-humans. We ended up devising 3 different elements of the city. One that connects humans and lichens, one that connects humans and pollinators, and a third that connects humans and migratory birds. And through each one of these platforms, we were really looking at how we design for life, not only human life, but all life, really kind of questioning this notion of human-centered design and accepting that there are many other stakeholders who are non-human who are absolutely important to our survival.
Awesome. Great. Well, welcome to all the panel. I think it's a really great range of perspectives on the topic. So we're very excited to start the conversation. So before we get started, I'm just going to adjust the view so everybody can see the full panel. And then I'm going to hand over to Catherine, who's going to walk through a few starter questions. I think we know it's going to be a pretty fluid conversation, so excited to hear everybody chipping in on things. And I'm going to accept questions from the audience over the chat thread. So we're actually over the Q&A thread. So if you, as we're going through, you have any questions that you want to ask to one of the participants on the panel in general, just put in a name, or otherwise you can put in a general question, and there'll be a couple of moments when I'll come in and pose those questions. But for now, I'll hand over to Catherine and the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Richard. And thanks again to all of our panelists for joining us tonight. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I'd love to start just by hearing a little bit more about all of the work that you do. So this question goes out to all of you. How would you describe kind of the futuring or forecasting work that you do as it pertains to your role? And why do you think the work is so important? Jen, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. So to focus more on the futuring element, a lot of what we do at Ford is we spend time working with teams across the enterprise, looking at what the future might be. So we do this through scenario planning, which is taking 4 different versions of the future and really kind of diving into what they mean. We start with an outside-in view. We start with painting a picture of the world, what's happening from a social, technological, economic, environmental, and political aspect, and then working with teams internally around what would you have to do as a business to survive, or how would your product survive in this world? And then, of course, walking them through all 4 of those and talking about what it might mean for them and how it might change their preparedness for the future and what they have to do to be prepared for that future. I will be the first one to say, and we always preface it with, we do not predict the future, no one can, but what we can do is help you prepare for it so that regardless of what future comes true, you've thought about how you might be prepared for that. So that's kind of our pitch for why we're valuable to help you be prepared for any future, regardless of what it is.
Great. Yi-Hyun, maybe I'll move to you next. I guess given that a lot of your work is done kind of as civic projects or as part of academia, how does your kind of role and perspective differ based on what you do?
Yeah, I'll speak actually more about a lot of the projects that I've done at MIT Design Lab with a lot of sponsored research partners, so industry corporates that we have been working together with. And in those cases, a lot of the futures work is really about creating, again, through scenario planning or mostly kind of design visions, experience design visions to stimulate a discussion about what possible futures might be out there. Many of them are technology focused. So we would think about, okay, how can we think about, let's say, a future of AI or a future of, let's say, AR, VR or XR, but then within the context of, let's say, within the context of the sponsors, their area of products or services that they create. So an example could be when we worked with Philips Lighting, we were thinking about how can we think about a caring city of the future where lighting plays a big role in creating that caring city experiences. So in these cases, we would think about products or ecosystems of products and services that focus on the human experience value of caring, but then thinking about possible let's say, service-driven experiences that uses connected lights as a way to deliver that experience.
Great. John, maybe I'll move up to you next to talk through a little bit more about why your work is so important.
Sure. Yeah. So as some executives have relayed to us, tell us what we're missing. What am I not seeing that's going to hit my business? So the intellectual aspiration is not just to run in there with some piece of interesting news that you read. Often some of our stakeholders are well-read, well-traveled, well-informed. So the challenge is to stay a step ahead, connect dots, develop scenarios, as Jen alluded to, that paint possible futures that could affect their business in ways they haven't thought about, and helping them navigate their strategic options and think about, how potential pitfalls, potential emerging opportunities that are coming based on, some nascent signals that could play out and could expand in a way that they haven't thought about. So that's one way, I think the key way we bring value to our internal stakeholders.
Great. And then Elliot, if you want to talk a little bit more about your specific role and the featuring work that you do, and why you think that work is important.
Absolutely. So I'm bridging between academia and the world of kind of research and cultural institutions. And oftentimes what I find as I engage with folks is there are a lot of people who are very familiar with languages of futures, oftentimes the future. We see a lot of projections of possible futures coming from politicians and coming from Hollywood, science fiction, et cetera. But many folks don't feel that they have a strong sense of agency over futures. They don't feel that they're able to determine futures in any way, or even wrap their heads around what it would mean to do futures research. And so a large part of my work comes down to, first of all, helping folks understand at least how I think of futures, which is these sets of narratives that exist in plurality that are really used to help us craft visions, shape discourse, build consensus, and form plans. And once we get to the point where we think of futures as these narratives that exist in a multiplicity, they become more malleable, they become tools, we can operationalize them, we can start to apply them in specific ways, and they feel less abstract, they start to become more kind of within grasp, and this is the effort toward democratization of futures.
That's interesting. I'm curious to talk a little bit more about the process of identifying trends. Out of everything that's happening in the world across the globe, social changes, advancements in technology that are happening every day. I'm curious to hear more about how you determine which trends are relevant and which ones are important to address and which ones might have implications on your business or your product. So John, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. So in terms of trend identification, as I mentioned earlier, we're a community of practitioners internally that we come together and a couple times a quarter, we'll go around and what are you seeing or what do you think is relevant? We seek to bring a very diverse set of points of view. So some of us are technologists, some are more business, some are researchers. We come from different walks. We're across the company. We're geographically diverse as a community. So sometimes someone's seeing something in India or Asia that we're not seeing in the United States. So we come together and we start building a set of trends that we're seeing with a point of view. So it's not enough just to say, well, this is going to happen. It's more, this is going to happen and potentially, it could affect our business in a certain way. We cross-reference it from outside, like looking at Gartner and other research outside of Intel to see, are they seeing things we're not seeing or vice versa. We have different tools that can scan blogs and social media, in aggregate patent activity, academic activity. So you can start bringing in quantifiable signals to start testing, is this thing really picking up speed or not? So that's kind of the harvesting. But then you have a big list of stuff, right? And so the question is, how do you start redacting it down to the few that matter the most? Because you can't go research 100 different things. And there's many approaches we've taken from crowdsourcing, go ask, a survey of the top 100 in a company to weigh in, or bring in a committee of experts to, an embedded small team. So we've tried all of the above approaches, and we combine the approaches to try to identify where things are resonating the strongest, and those tend to be the topics that we surface first.
Great. Does anyone have any other examples of tactics or ways that you've down selected or pulled from this wide array of trends to really kind of pinpoint the ones that are important to you or the problem that you're trying to solve?
I would jump in quickly and just say that I'm actually teaching my students right now about trends and signals. And I think especially as we come into this from a perspective of anyone who's not well-versed in the field, it can be really helpful just to start to separate out what we mean by signals and trends. Those might not be common terms that are used by everyone. So I usually think of a signal as a specific event that's happened in the recent past that gives us a view into what might be possible if that type of event were to build, magnify, or continue to disrupt in some way, if it were able to scale. But it's usually a single event, and it's oftentimes, mostly, the first time we've seen something like it. So it's got a degree of novel, it's got a novel quality. Once we start to see a pattern of those types of events, they might vary in characteristic, then we see this, this trajectory. That's what we call a trend. And the trend is certainly a helpful way to allow us to extrapolate further. The trends oftentimes that we're looking at when we're doing our work are a mixture of series of patterns, signals that we've spotted ourselves, as well as some of the trends that are coming from all sorts of trend scouting firms, agencies, et cetera. And so we mix those together, but the signals are actually super important, because the signals are the way that we can see the possible changes before they're visible as trends. It's kind of like the earliest view into what a future might look like.
Yeah, Yihan, I'd love to hear from you if there's any kind of frameworks or ways that you locate, recognize, or kind of organize signals and these inputs in an effective way.
Jen mentioned earlier about the STEEP. I think she didn't use the acronym, but she talked about, the STEEP, which is, social, technological, economical, environmental, and political. Those signals or trends that you can look for. Those definitely that we do also use as a way to look for the different areas. Additionally, I think being situated within a research institution, we also look a lot into emerging research. So what is the current research that's being done in different departments? So we would also add another, interviewing step, or having a conversation with with PhD students or researchers in different laboratories, seeing what they think or what they're working on at the moment, and where do they think is kind of the interesting development of, technology or engineering, or, of the topic they're working in. So that also gives us a glimpse into where the development of tech is happening, and that does help us in kind of in tracking, let's say, trajectory of technological, let's say, trends in the selected areas that we look, and that also helps us to kind of launch our imagination into how can we then situate that or use that as a way to imagine its possible adaptations, or its use in products or services or other experiences that we may want to imagine.
I would love it if someone could maybe give an example, maybe of a couple of signals they've noticed or collected that kind of turned into a trend that might have then led to a business opportunity, or any sort of opportunity for that matter, just to give some concrete kind of grounding to what we're talking about. John, you mentioned sustainability earlier as kind of a new opportunity that you uncovered for Intel. Is this something you could maybe talk through, kind of the process of how that opportunity came to be?
Yeah, absolutely. And Elliot, totally totally with you on we're on the hunt for signals, and then you start connecting these novel signals, and that starts forming a trend. And we do have a knowledge management database that helps us kind of organize this information. But on the sustainability, a couple interesting signals, like in 2019, 2020, Amsterdam put a halt to data center construction. And Amsterdam is the EU's hub for data centers, right? And one of the concerns was the energy footprint. And so that is directly going to constrain our customers' abilities to grow their business, right? That definitely caught my eye. It's nascent. Is it going to happen more and more places? I don't know, but that was a new signal. Another one was last year, Apple introduced the MacBook Air. And when you scroll through the features, when you go through Apple's site about the new display and the new this and the new that, at the bottom, they dedicated a ton of real estate to its green credentials, like that it's recycled aluminum, and that real estate was new. So I caught that, or we caught that, and it was a signal that to our customers, they're starting, and you know, Apple is so expert at marketing and how they position their products. It was a clear signal that they're leaning in on this, because previously in their laptops, I never noted that kind of real estate dedicated to the credentials of the product, the green credentials of the product. Those are a couple examples of novel signals that were new at the time, and now we're seeing it more and more. But there were a few others like that. You start connecting the dots, and you kind of see where things are headed, building out a trend, as Elliot suggested, from these signals.
That's interesting. You kind of have to be a bit of a detective or a sleuth and kind of look in unexpected places sometimes to find these, because it's not always straightforward.
It's that weird new thing. It's like Elliot said, it's that weird new thing, right? That, wow, data centers being halted in Amsterdam. I haven't heard about that before, right? And then you got to get curious and dig in and understand what's going on there.
Yeah, it's all about recognizing that little nugget that could be important someday.
I would add too that it also plays to your ability to connect the dots, right? When you're looking at things that feel maybe separate or disparate from one another, and understanding how something happening there with the halting of the data centers has other impacts down the road, and how those dots get connected, I feel is some of the secret sauce as well.
Yeah. Any advice? That seems to me kind of like a daunting task, to remember all of these things you've seen and maybe or maybe not connecting the dots. Are there any methods you use or ways that help you kind of make those connections?
I would add, a lot of times what we do is we talk a lot about values, behaviors, and attitudes. So how is it really impacting at the consumer level, and how is it impacting people? We know that generally speaking, values are formed in our young adult years, and the way that we see those values kind of get displayed has a lot to do with what's happening in the environment around people. But that those values stay relatively the same throughout their lives. So in terms of things being really seen as a trend is where we start to see shifts in those values, behaviors, and attitudes. And for us, that's how we start to define whether or not it's a signal or a fad versus a trend, is how we're seeing it play out.
I'm curious also to talk a little bit more about kind of the right time horizon for this type of future thinking. You know, you could look, obviously predicting something that'll happen next year, or maybe not obviously because no one predicted COVID, is a little bit easier than predicting something maybe 20 years out, because you kind of have a sense of where the world is going to be. So maybe, Elliot, you could start by just talking a little bit about that time horizon. What's the right horizon to look at? How far do you feel comfortable looking? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And maybe I'll start by just saying that oftentimes in the spaces that I'm working, we, as much as possible, try to move away from the space of prediction altogether. We try not to predict, because we know futurists have a track record of getting predictions wrong. And so instead, oftentimes what we're doing is really centering our energy around creating images of possible futures, to use the words of Jim Dater. We're creating images, and every one of those images helps us to kind of guide the plan making that we're doing in the present moment away from the undesirable and toward the preferable. So then as we think about the time horizon, Sometimes time horizons can be obstructive and don't necessarily help, but oftentimes they are really useful as we think about the way we're going to set up the signals around our purview, and think about the magnitude of change that's possible. And first of all, I would say that time horizon really depends on one's imagination. We all have limits to our imagination, and one person's imagination might be able to stretch out to 20, 30 years and still be able to fathom something that's a probable future, right? While another person maybe can only think 3 years in the future, and that's not a slight to that person, but just to say that our imaginations are kind of like muscles. We have to exercise them to get them to the point where we can do more with them. So everyone's imagination limits them at a certain point. Probably the best way to pick a time horizon is to say, all right, stretch your imagination a little bit farther than you feel comfortable. Get into your zone of discomfort. Again, to quote Jim Dater, getting into these spaces that first seem ridiculous. If it doesn't seem ridiculous, it's probably not a very valuable image of a future. And so then when we get there, we can kind of backcast back to the present to figure out the plans, the steps that we would need to take. And the last thing I'll say is, as we think about the context of, or the situation we're imagining as we develop images of the future, we can really start to reframe our time horizon. So if you're looking at historical geology, your time horizon very well could be in hundreds of thousands of years. If you're looking at a new fashion line for a fast fashion company, your time horizon might be 6 months. Right, so we've got all these different layers of pace that are operating simultaneously, going at different speeds, and you really need to understand your context in order to select the right time horizon.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and I feel like we were talking about this in one of our earlier conversations about really bringing an idea to the point of ridiculous. And yes, it might be ridiculous, but you still have to kind of make your clients or the people you're presenting this idea to seem reasonable and feasible. So any thoughts on how to kind of address that skepticism if you approach someone with a concept or idea that might seem ridiculous?
I think that may have a good link to how can you make it tangible so that you have something there on the table to have a conversation about. So you can continue to imagine these ridiculous futures, but having, let's say, a storytelling part of it or a physical artifact that you can create and put it on the table that's prototyped, or an interactive prototype, something that you can touch and feel and see how it may react. It can be a fake one, but something that reacts to you. Or maybe it could be, let's say, scenario cards that you can use to place them around and to use that as a way to maybe discuss on its acceptability, feasibility, or or different other criteria that you may use. So that can also help alleviate the levels of skepticism about the different futures, and also kind of use that as a way to explain kind of our process of how we got there also. So I think having a prototyping or kind of making these different ideas or these different futures tangible is a critical part in communicating futures, and as well as talking with the skeptics of these futuring exercises.
Yeah, that's a great point. Something we talk a lot about at SMART is the challenge of visualizing ideas or concepts that don't exist yet. And getting people, we do a lot of user research, getting our participants to really imagine and put themselves in that position of imagining a future state, even if they're totally abstract or even intangible. So yeah, I'd love to hear maybe from John and Jen. Jen, I know you do a lot of primary research in your position. Any tactics that you've done in research to really engage real users and get feedback on potentially abstract concepts? How do you kind of get them to get in that headspace?
Yeah, actually, I think I'll give just some examples in terms of when we're doing scenario planning exercises at the company. We work with teams across the organization, so anything from engineers to marketers and whatnot, and having to kind of get people to come along with us. So Elliot mentioned that you're telling a narrative, you're telling a story, and sometimes you get people that jump right in. And other times you get some skeptics, as Ewan was mentioning too, and trying to convince them that it's worth continuing to play along, if you will. So a couple ways that we do this. We do benefit in the fact that we have had our chief futurists doing futuring work here at Ford for over 15 years, and we've done many scenario planning projects here. So we can actually show, one of our favorite things to do is to show a video that was created 15 years ago, looking at 10 years out, and have a team watch it and say, what do you think? Did we get anything right? What do you think was outlandish, whatnot? And having people go, oh, wow, yeah, a lot of that stuff happened. And then saying, well, at the time, most people thought it was outlandish or crazy or whatnot, or said, thanks, now I got to get back to my real job. So we do benefit in the fact that we've had a history of futuring at the company. The other thing we do is we are quick to lean into the fact that all of these narratives and these stories are built upon data and are built upon trends that we're seeing. So starting to tell that story by referencing those trends. So one of our favorite things to do is to build a timeline and look back from, say, go back to 2000 and then build a timeline out to 2035 and say, okay, well, this is what was happening in the world, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Now let's look at what might happen 5 years, 10 years from now. And that often gets people to go, oh, okay, yeah, okay, I guess, yeah, you're right. As we see this trend starting to take shape, and as we start to extrapolate it out a bit further, that certainly does help. And then, if a last resort, if we're really still struggling to get people to kind of play along, is to play the, like, what would have to be true. Okay, this is hard to buy into. Well, what would have to happen that would enable a future like this? What would have to be true in the next couple of years, in the next 5 years, 10 years? And getting people to kind of take baby steps that way is often another useful tool.
John, going over to you, at Intel, is there any way or any methods you and your team use to help visualize the future to either participants in research or even engaging kind of internal stakeholders?
Yeah, and depending on the context, it can vary quite a bit. So on the data center side, it becomes more of a total cost of ownership type conversation, right? It's what are the problems that they're really worried about in a major cloud service provider? What keeps them up at night? And when you're thinking about more the consumer side, let's say laptops, then that type of research is very different. So on the latter, for example, if you're thinking about how you engage compute 3 to 5 years out, we might we'll do more primary research. We can test concepts in the context of what's happening currently. I know we previously chatted a little bit about like thinking deeply about in this era of COVID and the implications that maybe we will never be in offices in the way we used to be. So what's that mean to the future of work? And what does that mean to how we engage compute? When do you use a phone? When do you use a tablet? When do you use a PC? What is the favored, kind of device for what tasks? And when you're using a PC, what is it that you look for? And by the way, these views vary around the world. So in China, it's very different than in the US across these devices. But in the context of COVID, like for example, one phrase I heard I really like is transmission of presence. This is what we're doing now, right? Why do you get on a plane? Why did you get on a plane before? Why don't you get on a plane? What does it mean to be present? And if you were to redo WebEx, Zoom, and Skype from scratch, if you had a complete white canvas, how would you reimagine it? Would it be the way it is today, where you always have to ask someone, can you see my screen? Can you see my presentation? Can you hear me? Like, no, we wouldn't design it that way. I mean, it's so mediocre, right? So it's really kind of stepping back and thinking deeply about, kind of what's it mean to be present, and what kind of technologies or features might enhance our ability to work together as teams more effectively. Like a very simple example, a platform that maybe the audio, if the person is to your left, you always hear them on your left or versus your right. So it's more immersive as an example, right? But you can do a lot more than that. So that would be an example kind of on the client side.
Can I jump in on that? Because I think what you're saying there is really interesting, John. If we were to recreate some of these platforms from scratch, if we just gathered our super team and we could create whatever platform we could possibly imagine, it might look very different. And I'm going to take us on a little bit of like a non sequitur for a second, but Desi in the old 1950s TV show I Love Lucy is considered to be one of the folks who really revolutionized television. And he didn't invent television, but some folks have said he invented television, because before that point, before I Love Lucy, most television programs were treated like radio with a person staring at you, right? So you listen to the radio, we know what the radio is all about. There's like a person talking to you. Now you turn on the TV and you can see the person talking to you. Cool. But that's really not a leap into another format. That's just like visualization of the pre-existing format. So in I Love Lucy, this kind of show that most of us have seen, but we've also all forgotten about, Desi was really strong-handed, and he said, I want 3 different cameras. I want the scene to be showing all these different perspectives. I want to be kind of ad-libbing and riffing and using the chemistry between me and Lucy and creating this other format. It was no longer the radio visualized. It was a whole scene that was happening. And when we think about what's happening right now, I mean, here we are sitting kind of faces forward, talking to each other. It's essentially a phone call visual. And we haven't explored the vast realms of possibility for where we take these types of communications and interactions. There's so much potential here. I feel like we all need to become our inner Desi and find new ways to use these formats, right?
Yeah,
totally agree. Sorry. Yeah, no, I feel we're in the infancy. I was at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California, and I put on the VR glasses and I found myself transported to an alleyway in China where I'm looking around, they're looking at me, it's so immersive. And then another person walks in my field of view and says, hey, John, follow me. I filmed this. I can give you a tour. So who are you? Oh, I'm such and such. And where are you? I'm actually in Nairobi, Africa right now. But mentally, our minds, we were in China, right? I'm California physically. He's in Africa, but we're experiencing a different reality than everyone in the room. I think if the building caught on fire, I wouldn't have left because I wasn't there. I was somewhere else. But it was so remarkably rich. I was thinking, I can't wait to be able to have a coffee with my nephew in Paris and enjoy the scene and be immersed there without having to get on the plane to be there. And I can't wait for this to arrive. I think maybe 5-10 years from now, that kind of richness will be available. But then that starts informing the technologists on what do we need to do to enable that future.
Right. And also if we can capture, like the human experiences of spontaneity or exploration, or, or even if we can capture, human cues, spatial cues. So just like John explained, like if you see someone walking in front of you and then you can follow them, and then maybe if you move towards this person and then you can have a conversation with them virtually. So I think capturing a lot of these like human behaviors and qualities that we have in real life, and how can we then create a future experience with the technology and kind of reimagining from ground up. I think that's something be really interesting to see what we can have in the coming near future, hopefully in the next few months or a few years.
Yeah, and it's super interesting to think about, the implications of the technology and kind of the variety of different ways it can be used. I was just thinking about the movie Her and the video game that the main character plays, and it's exactly that technology that you're describing, but for a gaming industry. So, there's probably so many applications that we're not even considering for something like that. Okay, well, I'm going to pause for a second. I know we have some audience questions that I want to make sure we cover. And we also have a poll that we want to launch in time to collect some responses for the end of the session. So Richard, I'm going to launch the poll now if you want to go into some participant questions.
Great, yeah. So I have a question for Elliot, and I think we'll get into this in a bit more detail later, but it's a question really about engaging people in participatory futuring and the mediums that you use? And are there like internet-based platforms that you're using in that work as well? So I guess it speaks to this topic about place and mediums and presence and stuff. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say that I've found in the work that I've done with Chris Wobkin at the Extrapolation Factory is that oftentimes people who are not working seriously in future studies think of this space as a very kind of conceptual, abstract, very lofty, high-minded area to work. And so one of the first things that we try to do in our workshops is just bring it down, cut it down to size, and say, you know, we can have fun with this. We don't need to think of it as something that's too esteemed or too mythical. And, you know, as an example, one of the first workshops that we ran was a workshop in which we challenged folks to imagine an object you would find in a dollar store in the year 2050. And so we're not imagining like the vehicle of the future or the smart home or the smart city or any of these things. It's like, what is this kind of trashy, you know, generic brand knockoff thing that you can buy for maybe still 99 cents in the future? What does it look like? And what does that say about society? And so when we bring people through this portal into kind of a part of our world that we think of as being mundane and playful and kind of goofy, honestly, people let their guard down and they say, okay, yeah, I can engage at that level. That's a really nice starting point. And then usually we really try to get folks to go through an easy to understand, processable, step-by-step methodology, where we bring them through maybe a signals database that we've already collected, and then ask them to think about those signals in the context of the STEEP model that Jen mentioned earlier and Yihyun mentioned earlier. And then we ask them to tell a story about a day in the life in a future where they might find a product. And then we bring that product back into the year 2050. So that's kind of the hands-on physical way of working. Since the pandemic, we've had to really rethink a lot of our practices. Some of the things that we've done really hinge around narrative storytelling. We've been working in much smaller groups, and we've actually been using long-form engagement much more. Some of our workshops in the past have been very rapid, and we've really started to stretch them out and take time with people and really kind of soak into the ideas that they're putting out, and then kind of snowball them, so to speak. So, you know, something pops out and we build on it and build on it and build on it. And before you know it, becomes this really magnificent tale of a possible future.
Great, thanks. Yeah. We have one more question here, which is really about the, you know, over the course of the pandemic, it's been tough, but you know, humans have shown a lot of adaptability and sort of change. Now that we're kind of a year into it, it's hard to imagine returning back to how things were when we all have a really great opportunity to shape what comes next. What are the signals or trends that you've seen that you feel most excited about shaping over the last year? I'm sure you guys have been thinking about it a lot.
I think one interesting one that I favor is I think people are becoming more focused on, you know, kind of major issues of highest importance. So thinking about where you work, how you work, major challenges confronting society. It was an opportunity to kind of slow down and reset. I've talked to colleagues that, you know, we're saying on one hand, we don't want to complain. We're lucky, right? We have paychecks and all that. And a lot of people are far worse off, but they have said, you know, on the bright side, it has slowed down my life. I was flying like an idiot. I never saw my family. It's been like a pause, you know, where I'm now I'm exercising more, I'm healthier, living life with more intention. I think some of these things are going to stick. For those of us that had, you know, that I would say have had more fortune in terms of some relative stability during this time of having to stay at home more. Obviously, for some people, that hasn't been, you know, nearly as easy a situation. But I was trying to be positive because I think that was the intent of the question. Things that
I want to just offer the other side of the coin super briefly. I really think it's important when we do work around futures that we don't only veer toward the positive. Of course, dystopias have their own problems, but I think it's worthwhile to imagine ways that our future could unfold that are negative. And by doing that, what it helps us to do is to start to prepare for a world that we're not excited about, that we'd like to change. Right. And so somebody in the Q&A is asking, how do we make futures more equitable? One thing we can do is to start to imagine the problems of futures so that we can start working on them right now before they become problems. And one of the things that I'm seeing coming out of the pandemic is the massive shift in the US particularly, but in many parts of the world toward a non-retail consumer society. And I don't see that going away, unfortunately. I really think a lot of us will continue to order things online. We've learned this behavior now, and at the same time, stores are disappearing. And so if we don't like this world, we're gonna have to actively work on changing it. We can't just wait for retail to return. We can't wait for the new version of commerce to exist, because otherwise it's gonna be Amazon for everybody for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I might add to that as well when it comes to kind of the conversations that are happening now, and the conversation around mental health and how it's been really highlighted and brought to the forefront during this. I can actually see it connecting back to some of the technology conversations we've been talking about when it comes to, well, how would you build a better immersive experience? Or even you mentioned the movie Her, right? And what might a personal assistant of the future be there to help you do? And thinking through the fact that this pandemic has so much highlighted mental health and made it really just a daily part of conversation too. And I think in a lot of ways, particularly in our younger generations, we're seeing it being discussed very openly and freely, and less of this taboo conversation. So I think when you kind of pair that with the technology that's being developed and the ways that it might change in the future, I think that there's some hope there.
Right. One more thing to add, I think Elliot briefly mentioned on this, is the issue of the digital divide and how we can. That's an issue that we have observed at the moment of who has access to the tools, who has access to the web, and even this panel at the moment, like not everyone can join unless they know how to use Zoom or how to get online. So these issues that we'll have to address in as we are creating this another layer of digital society that's and going as we're also going to remote work and all of these remote events. Some of them will continue to stay on, or maybe we'll always have a physical event companion with a digital event happening at the same time. So and within the poll, we also have one option as a personal data ownership as one of possible future predictions. I think in addition to thinking about issues of data and who owns the data, but then we'll also address, this big issue of the digital divide in the future.
I had a couple more questions from the audience. I think one I just want to pose to there's a couple of questions on this, but I think sort of generally in futuring work, how do you think about diversity and inclusion in this work to make sure that we're kind of really talking to the right people and having the right people involved in the process to involve equity in this process? What are some of the ways that you guys have been thinking about it or even acting on it?
I think within Intel, in the context of AI and model development, there's been a lot of discussion and thought around kind of making sure models are representative of a diverse audience. For example, a lot of the models in AI are developed based on data, and data is almost entirely kind of Western generated. So how will these systems perform in an emerging continent like Africa, where almost none of the input data helps shape how the behaviors and norms of these models? This wasn't necessarily an AI, but it was an article that, and I don't know if it was entirely true or not, but it caught my eye that there was this automatic soap dispenser, and the training was sensitized to lighter skin. So if someone with darker skin went in there, it didn't dispense soap, and the meme was racist soap dispenser. But it highlights the importance of making sure that whatever products or technologies or endeavors you're in, you really have to try to encompass a very diverse set of perspectives, especially in a global company. So it's something we think a lot about.
Great. I can jump in and add my 2 cents here. I think the question is well taken. I think the word diversity is already fraught, and it's going to become much more troubled over time. I know just in the past year, conversations around diversity have already drastically changed, and I think they'll continue to change. I think there are a number of words like diversity that are especially problematic when they're treated as binaries. So we can say, oh, well, that was a diverse group and this is not a diverse group. I think it's maybe more useful to talk about diversity as a continuum. So this is more diverse than it was before, and we can make it more diverse than it has been, right? And so oftentimes we talk about ethnic diversity, racial diversity, age diversity, diversity of various abilities. I think as we go forward, our notions of diversity will change. We'll start to talk about diversity of intelligences, diversity of psychological frames, diversity of neurocomposition. And all of these diversities will become more prevalent. They're difficult for us to talk about because we don't have very good ways of quantifying or understanding those scales of diversity. Just in terms of how my practice tries to increase or amplify the diversity in the work that we do. First of all, I'll say we're not perfect, and we keep trying harder and harder. And every time we see blind spots, and we reflect on those. But we've done projects where we'll run a workshop literally on a street corner. Go out to a street corner in New York City, and whoever walks by ends up being invited to take part in a futures workshop. And when we do that, what we're doing is relinquishing the control over the group of folks who have the opportunity to take part. Is that a perfect way to go? No, because it might actually exclude folks who wouldn't be walking out on a street corner. But it's one of the experiments that we've run, and I think there's a lot to learn from it.
Great. I mean, so we have a few more questions, but I think we're kind of running a little bit tight on time. So maybe, Catherine, I'll hand it back to you to hit some of the other things we had.
Yeah, I think one of the questions we had also kind of covers one of the audience questions. But, because you might be looking decades into the future, how do you really go about kind of proving the effectiveness of your futures work? Elliot, I think you mentioned that you don't make predictions in case you're wrong, but there has to be kind of some way that, you show that your work is effective and that it's offering value. Maybe Jen, I think you spoke about this a little bit earlier, so maybe you can take it.
Sure. Yeah, it's always an evergreen question when you're doing futures work. So certainly, again, we have leaned into things that have happened in the past, and we look at some of our past scenario planning projects. The other thing we do, I mean, we're constantly checking in with the groups that we work with and asking, did you get novel ideas from the conversations with us? Is it impacting your plans? Has it changed any of your plans, or did new ideas come out of it? So this is where, some of it is less obvious right at the end of a conversation, and it needs a little time to build. So we'll also kind of go back and check in with teams maybe a month or two afterwards just to see what's going on. But ultimately, we serve to help open the eyes of people that we work with, and our hope is that it changes some minds. It challenges some of the preconceived assumptions that you might have. And so, anytime that we're feeling like we have a team where someone's had an aha moment of, oh, I never considered that before, it's a win. And we consider that to be a win. Thinking more strategically from an organizational perspective, we then will work with teams from a strategy side to test it against the scenarios and say, okay, well, have you run it through this test? Has it made it through those tests? And if it's robust in each of the scenarios, or if it's robust, say, in 3 out of the 4 scenarios, then it's the type of thing we like to move forward. So we're also another way that we look for the effectiveness is how many teams are using that to help defend strategies.
on our end, like one area where it can be particularly rewarding is if you see a product feature make it to the marketplace, and there's line of sight back to a contribution that helps shape the thinking behind that. So you go from presenting some notion, it was internalized by the team, it helped shape their thinking. They put investment into it, so they spent money. Now the rubber hits the road if you're in a corporate setting, right? And then it finally makes it into the marketplace, and if it's successful. But then there's the flip side. Why did we miss this, right? And we go through that a lot. It's like, I can't believe we didn't see it, but we were talking about it, but we somehow couldn't activate it. Like Intel famously missed the mobile phone business. Like, how many times have we kind of internally wrestled with how did we miss that? So it's also recognizing where we did miss as well.
I think one more thing could be just, if we can stimulate a further discussion about possible consequences of if we follow this path, or what is the consequence of having such technology or technological service or product ideas, or a future that's really based on that. So if we can use these futures work to have a discussion about possible implications, whether it's about ethical implications or social or psychological implications within society, I think that's also a big win. So we can, I think, Elliot, I think you mentioned this last time in our other conversation, if we can imagine the problems of the future through the futures work, I think that's a big win.
Any adds to that?
Yeah, totally. I echo what all my colleagues said. I love hearing how everyone else thinks, and it sounds like we're really aligned on this question. The one thing that I'll add, in addition to everything else, is that when we do work at my practice, and when I do work through my research and in academia, one of the big objectives that we're keeping front and center is having people walk away from the work that we do with an increased sense of agency around futures. If they walk away feeling like they can control or change or have impact on possible futures through the stories that they're telling, the productive fictions that they're generating, I think that is a win. So in addition to seeing products come out of the stories that we tell, or increased kind of salience of possible outcomes, I think just that notion of self-control and agency is super important for us.
Yeah, just for some of the participants here who might want to go back and start implementing this type of thinking at their jobs or wherever they go to school, how would you recommend that they start? Is there any advice you could give for someone, let's say they go back to their office and they want to start taking more of this future-focused approach to their product or their service? How would they even start to do that within their organization? Any advice, tips?
A couple thoughts. One is think about your relationship with the folks that you're trying to influence. If you're in a business setting, where are you in a continuum? Do they even know who you are? Will they hear you out? Do they value your opinions? Are you a trusted partner? There's a long continuum. So really critically assessing where you're at, and if you're not where you need to be, think about how can you raise your credibility, especially if you're an unknown person. You run up to some senior executive, I got a great idea, and you have to listen to me. That executive may have 1,000 people, and 5 times a day, someone's coming into their office saying, if you don't do this, this is a train wreck coming. You have to do this, right? Now, how would you feel on the other end at the end of the week, right? When you've had all these things coming in, it's all starting to become noise. So you really need to think about how do you differentiate yourself such that audience, you have that kind of that credibility to be able to influence them. I think that's key, because you may have that great insight, but you may be really frustrated because you're not able to translate that into a meaningful result in your organization. So I think that's an area to really think about.
And then I guess someone who's trying to maybe at their job, maybe form a group. John, you mentioned you have a bunch of different disciplines come together and talk about it. Who should maybe be involved in these projects? Who should be in the room when it comes to having these forecasting or featuring discussions? This question can go for anyone.
I think a breadth of perspectives is really important. People that are willing to challenge the status quo is important. Folks that are intellectually curious, they never want to stop learning is an important quality of the types of people that I feel I value when I'm in these settings. Who can, as Elliot kind of also referenced, you know, like if you could reimagine it, how would you do it? And really, you know, people who are really good at kind of unanchoring from the paradigms of the present and really thinking about deeply about, you know, the challenge and how it could unfold, I think are all important attributes.
I'll jump in quickly and just say in projects that I do, oftentimes, one, I'm looking for folks who can kind of get me out of my filter bubble, especially as so many of us are tied in some way to social media platforms that are algorithmically based. We get in these spaces where we're hearing the things that we're already thinking, and it doesn't stretch our imaginations. And then the second thing that I oftentimes do is, as I'm inviting subject matter experts into the conversation groups, go through the STEEP model, make sure I have folks who are thinking from a sociological perspective, people who are thinking from an economic perspective, technological, ecological, and political, and kind of, you know, triangulate, get this comprehensive view of expert perspectives that are helping me to think about the question at hand.
Jen, any input from you? I know we spoke a little bit about having engineers, having designers, having people with different backgrounds participate. So any thoughts on how to kind of engage them as well?
Yeah, I mean, big plus ones to what else has already been brought up. I think one of the biggest things is just really pushing to get people who think differently than you, getting different perspectives. So absolutely, at a company like Ford, we have quick, easy access to people from all different parts of the business. So that's really helpful. But I think Elliot brought up some great points too with going through the STEEP factors and trying to get experts in these different realms that are not typically discussed. Specifically at Ford, right? We've got lots of experts in automotive or mobility in these spaces that are very well known within the company. But when I say like the magic really happens is when you bring outsiders in to those conversations and people who are experts in politics, economics, environmental issues, things like that. City design, for example, like bringing that into the conversation really adds richness that we would miss if we didn't bring in some external thought. So really purposely doing that, and purposely, I think, hitting different regions of the world is really important as well. We get hugely different perspectives in the different parts of the world. And kind of going back to the diversity conversation. So, different age regions, all of that. So having, we lean into the generational cohorts quite a bit, and making sure that those are represented in conversations, because you see the way that those values are shaped and the way that they are kind of displayed outwardly being different, and kind of people's interpretation of different things being shaped differently. So I think just keeping the conversation and keeping the group as diverse in all the ways that diversity presents itself as possible is going to add some richness to that conversation and output a much more just a much stronger future perspective.
Yeah, and if you're starting new in this futures work, I think the one thing that can help is to read through all of the kind of future visions that's out there. There's so many that's already been made by different organizations, different groups, different people, like Jen said, from different parts of the world. So look through those visions and see, and try to, maybe you can map similarities or differences, or what are the key ideas that's being discussed there. What is a time frame that each one of those are talking about? And it kind of, that can help you to get an idea of the different future visions or scenarios that's been made. And by creating a big map of that puts all of these together, you can identify possible, areas that hasn't been explored, or maybe that can also give you an inspiration of how to maybe start about thinking about possible futures.
Well, I think we're just up on time. Richard, any other questions we wanted to slide in? If not, I can share the results of our poll. I think I can do that. Can you all see?
Oh.
Yeah.
So it looks like people are pretty optimistic about personal data ownership. But as we discussed, that'll come with a lot of implications as well.
Yeah. I had one kind of question, just like personal one based on this. I'm kind of curious in sort of general, do the teams you work with tend to gravitate more towards like dark futures or bright futures, or is it always really nicely balanced? I'm kind of curious in your experience, because there can be things that are very motivating about dark scenarios that drive action, but yet creative people like to be optimistic, right, and create things that are going to help. So how do you balance that optimism and pessimism at the same time?
I'll share a super quick quote that I heard first from the futurists at Royal Dutch Shell, which is that there's nothing to learn in heaven and nobody wants to visit hell. And so, they say that kind of jokingly, but in all honesty, if we can paint narratives that are a mix of good and bad, utopia, dystopia, that actually mirror the types of convoluted challenges we experience in our own lives, they're probably actually much more compelling than if we go all dark or all light.
Yeah, I think that's fabulous. And then on top of that, it's not uncommon that after we talk about futures with teams, they'll say, "Oh, wow, those are dark." And then we need to turn the conversation into, okay, well, where's the opportunity? If this is what's happening in the world, what does that mean for you? And how might you find success? Like, how might we need to change to be successful? And so sometimes it's having to get them to feel a bit challenged, if you will, to start to turn that into, okay, well, where's the opportunity? So let's accept that this is the change that's happening. Now, what do we do about it?
In sometimes in forming a recommendation, we raise the idea of a minority report, having someone in there who's passionately views it very differently. So if the presentation and recommendation makes it feel like it's heaven, have that vocal minority voice that's going to say, wait a minute, this actually could be a ticket to hell, right? So it forces that broader conversation. I think if you have a diverse audience, some will gravitate towards the future's great, people are going to use more compute, we'll build more chips, and then you can have others there that anchor off Andy Grove's quote early in Intel's existence called "Only the Paranoid Survive," and they're thinking about all these threats that are going to disrupt us as a company. So it's a blend.
Great. Makes sense. So I think we're just about out of time. So I'm just going to firstly just thank all the panelists and also thank Catherine for being a marvelous moderator. And I'll just quickly share one slide just on the next event in the series, which will be coming up next month. Let me just pull it up. Hopefully you guys can see this. Okay, yeah. So next month we're hosting a similar event, similar format, and really this one's going to be all about using sort of creative methods in design research to gain deeper insights. So really we'll be trying to pull experts from across different parts of research, thinking about the influence of technology, thinking about how this sort of applies more at a social level or an individual level. And should be a really rich conversation. So just invite you to, if you're interested, sign up on the URL below, which is go.smartdesignworldwide.com/beyond. And we would love to welcome you again. So thank you again to all the panelists. It was a great conversation. Felt like I definitely learned some things, and we will see everybody soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
you guys.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye.